So welcome to Lania and Zeke and Steve. We are so excited to have you all here for this session on bringing fire back to the landscape and bringing fire back to the people. I think, we had our earlier session today was with Merrick Smith with the Nature Conservancy and Brian Farabee with Forest Service, and they really kind of teed up a lot of the things we're going to be talking about for the rest of the workshop here. And a big part of obviously what both of them talked about was the need for vastly increased amounts of fire back on the land in various different capacities, and sort of what the logistical challenges are to that from a workforce perspective or a training perspective or a social perspective. And then also the really great work that's being done sort of across partnerships to bring fire back to the land. So I guess Lania, were you planning on kicking this off, or how do you guys want to do this?
Yeah, you tell me. I'm happy to go first, whatever.
And Melissa, did you want to introduce everyone real quick before they talk?
Yeah, I just figured I'd introduce them in the order that they're gonna.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Go.
And then just so they know, they're all co-hosts so they can share their screens.
Great. Okay, well, I will introduce you guys and then you can thumb wrestle for who's going to go first or whatever. But Lania Quinn Davidson is the director of University of California Ag and Natural Resources Fire Network, the Women in Fire Training Exchanges, which we heard Merrick talk about, the WTREX, and the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council. Her primary focus is on the human connection with fire and increasing the use of prescribed fire for habitat restoration, invasive species control, and ecosystem and community resiliency. Lania works with private landowners to bring fire back as a land management tool and collaborates at the state level on policy and research related to prescribed fire, and helps inspire and support prescribed burn associations and nationally through her work and leadership on prescribed fire training exchanges. Lania is passionate about using prescribed fire to inspire and empower people, from rural ranchers to agency leaders to young women pursuing careers in fire management and everyone in between. We'll also be hearing from Steve Rondeau, the Natural Resources Director for the Klamath Tribes. He's an enrolled member of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and grew up at Forks, Washington. After earning a degree in Natural Resources Management from Washington State University, Steve worked on fire crews for Washington State DNR and U.S. Forest Service before working as a forester. Steve worked for 3 years for the Cow Creek Tribe as a Natural Resources Director before being hired by the Klamath Tribes, where he spent 7 years working as a forest manager before being promoted to Natural Resources Director 4 years ago. And Zeke Lunder is the founder of the Wildfire website, blog, and YouTube channel, The Lookout, which he started following the Dixie Fire when he realized that both social media and the regular media weren't telling the kinds of stories he wanted to tell, and that, in his words, quote, "we were drowning in information but lacking context." Zeke spent 20 years running wildfire mapping crews, and in 2011 founded the wildfire mapping and consulting company Deer Creek Resources with his wife, Erica. Feel free to correct me if I got any of that wrong. Okay, so Lania, do you want to get started with this?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to go first. Thanks for the introduction. And I just want to say I did this workshop a couple years ago and just found it really valuable. I think that you all do such an important job, which is helping tell the story of fire and why it's important. And I just really value my interactions with the media. And so I see a couple familiar faces. I've done quite a few stories with Alex and with Kylie, and just really appreciate all of you. So I just wanted to preface with that. So I'm going to share my screen. You all see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I wanted to talk today a little bit. I'll give some context of just the situation that we have in California. As Melissa said, I work for the University of California and lead the statewide extension program. But I've worked on prescribed fire related stuff for many years, probably around 16 years now, and just feel really passionately about it and work on a lot of policy stuff and building capacity for prescribed fire, and really just trying to inspire and empower different kinds of people to be involved in fire management and in prescribed fire. So this photo is from Trinity County, where I grew up, which is in one of the more remote parts of California, in Northern California. And this is kind of looking down toward my hometown. And I grew up in a very fire-prone landscape. So when I was a kid, just a huge part of my childhood and my life, and increasingly so. My mom's still there, and yeah, fire is just such a big part of our culture in California. So how can we change it from being a good thing, a bad, scary thing, to something that's really part of who we are? I wanted to just start with, I know you all probably know this, and I don't know what Merrick and the other speakers said earlier, but I think it's really important context just to think about the change that we've seen in the last decade or so, and how fast things are moving and how much fire is changing. And this is a image of the Dixie Fire footprint, and the red are high severity areas, so areas that burned at high severity, which means it killed all of the mature vegetation that was growing there. So the Dixie Fire was almost 1 million acres, and well, Zeke probably knows the exact number, but somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 acres of high severity. So we're seeing in California a pretty massive shift right now. We're losing forest cover. And I wanted to bring this up because I think it's something that we don't hear a lot about. I mean, we hear about fires being catastrophic and the losses that are occurring, but I think this notion that we're actually seeing our forested landscapes convert to non-forest vegetation, and that we're starting a pattern and a trajectory that is going to be hard to reverse unless we bring more good fire to the landscape. So there was a really good paper that came out last year by a guy named Zach Steele that showed the Southern Sierra Nevada has seen a 30% loss of mature forest in a 9-year period. That's pretty remarkable number. So I just keep that in your mind as you're thinking about fire issues and just the scale of change that's happening right now. And of course, that's true for communities as well as for the larger landscape. And so we've just seen such unprecedented impacts to communities and homeowners and the cultural values that we care about in California. I also wanted to point out just the impacts that we're seeing from not only the actual severe fires that we're having on the landscape, but also from fire suppression. And these two photos I think are really valuable and hopefully something that might be of interest to some of you. One is the fish kill that happened on the Klamath River in 2022 from the McKinney fire. And, last year everyone said that, it wasn't that bad of a fire season in California, but there were some pretty incredible things that happened, and not in a good way. The McKinney fire was, by some measures, a small fire, but very severe, and triggered some pretty crazy debris flows that went into the Klamath River and caused a complete fish kill along somewhere between a 20 to 40 mile stretch of river. And this didn't get a lot of attention, but I think it was a really notable impact, and just something that I thought should be on your radar. This other photo is a photo of fire retardant that's dropped directly into a stream. And this is over in Tehama County. And again, there's a lot of impact from fire exclusion, but also a huge impact from actual fire suppression activities. And I think this is something that we need to be thinking about in the whole way that we manage fire, is what are the actual suppression activities? What are those impacts on the ground? And then even more importantly, what are the impacts of fire exclusion? And so most of the landscapes that we know and love in California and across much of the West and across much of the country are dependent on frequent fire. And so are the people that come from those places. And so we can talk all day about the impacts of catastrophic fires, but there's a more secret kind of subtle problem going on across the landscape, and that's not enough fire. And so of course that's the premise and foundation for all of the work that we do with prescribed fire and cultural burning, is how do we bring fire back to the landscape? How do we bring fire back to people and to communities, and really restore the relationship with fire? And then how do we build a workforce and a practice that involves a lot of different people? You know, we don't have enough people to do the work that needs to happen. And so a lot of the work that I do is about trying to diversify the fire workforce and the fire community, and to really think about how to engage new types of people, local people, and how to just really empower a whole change in the fire culture. And so for today, I'm going to talk about some of the community-based work that I do here in California with prescribed burn associations and some of the policy work that I've done. And then I will talk about the Women in Fire Training Exchange Program briefly at the end, the W-Tracks, which it sounds like Merrick touched on, but that's a program that I lead that's national, international, and really focused on bringing diversity into the fire workforce. So let's first jump into thinking about community-based fire and really this notion of bringing fire back to people and back to communities, which may sound like, oh yeah, that sounds great, or it's kind of obvious or something, but honestly, even 5 to 10 years ago, this was not a big part of the conversation in the fire world. The photos that you're looking at right now would make many people who work in fire very uncomfortable. The photo on the left is actually one of Zeke's photos. That's his son out on a prescribed burn. And then the middle photo are some ranchers that I work with in our local prescribed burn association. And then we have Margot Robbins, who is up on with the Klamath River tribes and the Cultural Fire Management Council in that other middle photo. And then on the far right is my colleague Jeff Stackhouse burning in a winter burn in some oak woodlands in the north coast of California. But all of these photos show different kinds of people using fire, and different ages and different backgrounds. And, you know, we're pretty used to fire professionals looking like the picture in the left here. And for a long time, that was what was comfortable. And that was kind of what was expected. If you said, we're going to do a prescribed burn, you would envision that it would look like that on the left. And the work I'm trying to do, I'm really trying to shift it to the photos on the right. We need those folks on the left too. And that's great. Let's keep them working in this space. But how do we make space for the people on the right? How do we make space for our tribal partners, for our kids, for women, and for all of the talented and, you know, wise people who have so much to offer in fire management? So I'm really devoted to creating space for that. And whether that means breaking down policy barriers or providing training or any number of things, that's what I'm committed to. And that's the work that I do. So we do have a lot of challenges in this work. And when I started working on these issues, the list was long. I mean, for one, just at a basic level, how do we inspire people to even be interested in this, or to know that it's available to them, or to even, you know, feel like that door is open. So inspiration is a big part of the strategy of bringing more fire to the landscape, is getting people excited about it, and then providing training and, you know, building capacity for the work, but also addressing liability concerns, lack of insurance, and then lack of tribal sovereignty in this work as well. So this was kind of the list of things I'd say in the last 10 years that I've been trying to tackle with my various partners, and really trying to break down all of these pieces so that we can have more of a fire culture in California. So on the kind of inspiring and empowering and training front, one of the big things that we've been able to do in California is develop prescribed burn associations and community-based organizations who can implement prescribed fire and cultural burning. And so, you know, even like I said, even just 10 years ago, there really wasn't much of a venue for that. I mean, if you were a private landowner or a community member and you wanted to use prescribed fire on your property, you pretty much had zero options except for to work with CAL FIRE, our state fire agency, and they would come in and do it for you. But their list was long and they weren't very effective at doing this work. And we were just kind of at rock bottom with prescribed fire in California. And most of the things that I'm saying for California are true across the broader Western US. So This is a pervasive issue, this lack of opportunity for people who don't work in fire suppression. And so my colleagues, a couple of colleagues and I, and one of our local ranchers, we actually went out to Nebraska and learned about prescribed fire in the Great Plains. And one of the models that they have been super successful with in the Great Plains are prescribed burn associations, which are essentially community cooperatives for prescribed fire. People getting together and volunteering and helping each other out, kind of like a barn raising or a branding, very rooted in farming and ranching culture, and kind of a no-brainer, right? Like people can get together and help each other out and get a lot of good work done. So we brought that model back to California in 2017 and started the Humboldt County Prescribed Burn Association at that time, which was the first PBA in the Western US. From then to now, the momentum and the interest has just been unbelievable. And as you can see on this map, we now have prescribed burn associations in, more than half of the state. We have 24 different groups actively burning around California, and thousands of volunteers, landowners, community members, cultural practitioners engaged in that work. So you can look at that website, calpba.org. That's kind of our central website with information on PBAs and links to the local PBAs that are in different places. One of the other big things we were able to do is pass a bill that mandated the development of a state certified burn boss program. And that was really intended to provide recognition and then benefits to experienced private practitioners who historically would have had no way to be recognized. So, the federal and state agencies have their own systems of qualifications, and those are largely inaccessible to people like me. So this state certified burn boss program was just another way of breaking down this barrier and saying, hey, we have a legitimate role in this space. We can do this work and we deserve to be recognized and to be protected. So that state certified burn boss program was a little slow to get off the ground because it is a certification that CAL FIRE and state fire training provides, which of course, again, was pretty uncomfortable for those fire agencies. But we've just kept at it. And at this point, it's running pretty smoothly. And we have almost 30 state certified burn bosses in California now. And that list is growing and growing. We're hosting the classes and training people. And that's going to be a big part of the solution here. Now, we've done a lot of policy work as well. And the policy work is really intended to provide protections and recognition, like I mentioned before, for different kinds of practitioners. There's been a lot of movement on cultural burning, and a lot of the policy work that we've done focus on prescribed fire. We've also made sure to include cultural burning there and to really try to carve out space for that and to keep it from being overly burdened with bureaucracy and with requirements and things of that nature. So we had 2 bills in 2021 that defined cultural burning. And I should say that a lot of the policy work that we do around cultural burning is in collaboration with tribal and cultural partners, especially the Karuk tribe, but also we work a lot with folks from the Yurok tribe and Don Hankins, who's based out of Chico area. We have a pretty strong network of people who work on policy in the space. So those 2 bills define cultural burning and cultural practitioner. And then we also had 2 bills that essentially put cultural practitioners on par with federal and state burn bosses. So really trying to make sure that that recognition is there and that they have the same protections that you would if you were a federal state burn boss. Oh, and I should say that Good Fire report down in the bottom right-hand corner was a report that the Karuk tribe commissioned, and that is really a fantastic summary of the barriers to cultural burning and prescribed fire and really clear policy suggestions for how to address those barriers. So I recommend checking that out if you wanted to dig in, and that's being updated right now. The other 2 really big things that happened in California over the last couple of years are that we changed the liability standard around prescribed fire. So we were actually able to change the law to be more protective of prescribed fire practitioners. And that was a huge deal, something that I think we all were amazed to have been able to pass that change. So Senate Bill 332, that was just a huge win for the prescribed fire community. And then this year, last year, we passed a bill, Senate Bill 926, that mandated the development of a prescribed fire claims fund, which is actually like a state-backed insurance fund for prescribed fire. And we're the first state to ever do this. It's actually a really big deal. We have $20 million sitting in an account, and prescribed fire practitioners like myself can enroll projects in this fund for free. And it'll provide $2 million of coverage in the case that something goes wrong. So it, historically, until this fund was available, there was essentially no insurance option for prescribed burners. So if I were a private burn boss, I'd gone through the state certification, I'm ready to go help out my local PBA, or I'm ready to work, for hire doing this work, I would have no insurance options. So it's pretty much a non-starter. I mean, who would want to do this work, especially for hire, if you can't insure it? So this claims fund, which rolled out in June, is just a total game changer. And I think it's just kind of unleashing so much opportunity that we didn't have before. So I recommend checking that out. It's a pretty big deal. And then I just like to show this picture. This, I like to call this is like California's prescribed fire community. And of course, there are a lot more people than are in these photos, but these are the folks who are leading on this. And I think one of the things that I love about the community-based fire movement in California is it is just totally fueled by passion and volunteerism and community organizers, basically. And so a lot of the folks you're seeing in these pictures are just that. They're community organizers. They've done things that are they don't benefit them personally. It's really for the larger good. And it's because fire is fun and we're all friends, and there's just a real strong sense of community in this work. So I'm really proud of that. And I'm so lucky to get to work with all these amazing people. So just briefly, and then I'll start wrapping up, I did want to share with you about the W-Trex. And I don't know what Merrick shared with you when he talked with you this morning, but this is a program that I lead that kind of grew out of the larger training exchange program. But we realized that, there are so few women who work in fire, especially in the kind of, professional wildland fire scene, but across the board, just a real lack of diversity. I mean, fire is a lot like the military. It's mostly white men, very few opportunities for leadership for women or other underrepresented groups. There's just so much growth that could happen. So we developed this program as a way to create space for training and inspiring women and everyone's invited. We also make a point to include men in this work. It's really important to have male allies and really to just start shifting and changing the culture of fire management. So we host these W-Trex events, typically one per year somewhere in the US. So we have like one main domestic event. And then in the last year, we've started to grow the program and taken it into international partners and started having some different events focused on different things. It's just a really awesome program, and people feel connected and supported, and there's a level of mentorship that you just don't get really anywhere else in fire. So the demand for these events is just growing and growing, even though we're hosting more events. It's like we typically have around 150 to 200 people who apply to come to the W-Trex, and they're 2-week events. It's all prescribed, we burn as much as we can together, and we do a lot of other workshops and things. But we typically only can take 25 to 30 people at any given event. So the demand is just kind of off the charts. Last year, I partnered with the Karuk tribe to host a W-Trex focused on Indigenous women and on cultural burning, or burning for cultural objectives. And so that was a really interesting event. We out on the Mid-Klamath River area, we brought people from 43 different tribes to California. We even had a few women from Australia and several tribal members from Canada. And it was just a really powerful event. And the Karuk tribe is going to continue hosting those events. They're actually kind of developing a whole program around that because there's just such a need for that level of connection and sharing and learning together. So that was a really wonderful event. And then in March of this year, we went to South Africa and hosted the first international WTREX in partnership with Volunteer Wildfire Services there in South Africa. And that was just an absolutely incredible event. We had people there from 11 countries across 5 continents, learning and sharing and burning together. And what an incredible place to be working on fire. So that was the first international event. We also had an event that happened in Banff in Canada in May. And then we're actually currently planning an event in Portugal for early February. And our next domestic event will be in April on the Niobrara Valley Preserve, which is a nature conservancy preserve in Nebraska. So if any of those things pique your interest, let me know. We always welcome media and storytelling from those events. And with that, I'll wrap it up. So I don't know if we'll do questions later, I think, but feel free to reach out.
Yeah, I think we'll wait till the end and then do questions. I feel like you maybe teed up Steve a little bit better than Zeke, but again, that's up to you guys. Who wants to go next?
Sure, I'm happy to go next.
Okay. Thank you, Steve.
Let's see.
Did you have slides that, did you want to share them? Okay, great. Awesome.
Let's see. Okay. Thank you for having me. Steve Rondo, Natural Resources Director for the Klamath Tribes. And so what I want to share with you today is an example of tribal forest management and how it related to a wildfire that came through the Klamath Reservation area in 2021. So historically, the Klamath tribes covered 22 million acres as their ceded lands. Through the treaty and subsequent negotiations, the tribes ended up with an land area of 1.2 million acres. Through an erroneous survey, that ended up being around 700,000 acres. And then ultimately in 54, it was terminated and the land was taken. So the Klamath tribes have reserved treaty rights on the former reservation lands, and a majority of those lands are managed by the U.S. Forest Service. These are photos of examples of the forest before termination and prior to the land being taken over by the Forest Service and managed under their regime. So in the early years, when the BIA overlooked the management of the forest, when the tribes owned it, the Klamath tribes were considered the, if not the second most wealthy tribe in the nation. Now we're one of the poorest since our land has been taken and the resources with it. But in the early days, the BIA performed inventory on the forest. And from that inventory, we found that what the forest consisted of largely was a dry forest dominated by ponderosa pine that were fire dependent. And in those times, what we look at here is an example of trees that were 6 to 21 inches. So smaller trees. This is showing that there were very few small trees between 6 and 21 inches. And then what we did is we redid the survey and found that there's a lot more small trees across the landscape that have grown in over time as a result of the treatment. This is an example of research that we did from the inventory where historically there were white fir trees, and white fir trees in a ponderosa pine system are very productive trees that use resources very quickly and aren't very resilient over time. So they grow fast and die young, but they get very big. And so what we see here historically in one of the areas of the reservation is that there were very few large white fir within those areas. And then over time, over the course of roughly 100 years, we see that now this dark blue color, there's a lot more white fir in those areas. So that's lending itself to saying that these young productive trees have established and grown into these sites over time and have increased the amount of large non-resilient trees across the landscape as it's reduced some of the resilient trees. And so if we look at it in graph form, up here in the top section, we see that, again, historically, there were a lot fewer trees per acre, and now there are a lot more. And you can see that we went from, roughly, lower than 20 trees per acre to over 120 trees per acre. So we went from large old trees that were few to many young trees in the forest. And then in addition, basal areas is giving us a similar story. So another research study that we performed on the reservation was a fire study. And we worked with Andrew Merschel, who was a researcher out of Oregon State University. And he established plots on the reservation in an area over 100,000 acres and found what the how many fires burned across the landscape, and then at what period of time those fires burn. So if we look down at the bottom section here, we can see, and there was a couple of old trees that we found, whether it was stumps or burned out small snags that still existed. We were able to get the fire return interval off of that. And we found that the fire return interval within the Klamath Reservation was about every 12.5 years. And if you look at this graph, you can see that there were small fires burning across the landscape in many different areas over time. In some places, we could see that there were large fires that burned across the landscape, but none of those fires were devastating. They all would have been considered good fire. And then as we get into the 1900s, you can see that the fires started to be suppressed and then they ended altogether. So that really changed the composition of the forest over time. This is a photo of in the Crater Lake National Park. It's an example of what forest should look like. So as you can see, these are very old, large ponderosa pine trees, and it's fairly open. And so with some of the research that we did on the former reservation, we found that trees don't grow in a spatial way where we plant them like corn these days. It's really diverse how they grow. And what we did is we performed some historical reconstruction plots across the forest where we put 5-acre plots in and measured all of the trees that were there over 120 years ago. So before fire suppression began, we identified what trees were there at that time. And so if we look at this as an example, we can see before any kind of treatment, this is what those plots looked like for the most case. And then we have a couple of different types of treatments here. And over to the right, this is what we would like to see in a good treatment that's really working with the natural diversity of the stand. Adaptive management, again, you can see it's a lot of spatial complexity, and there are large linear openings within these stands, and these would change the way fire behaved. And then more commonly today with forestry practices, what we see is a spatial stand where everything is spaced out, whether it's 10 or 20 feet apart from each other, and they're really trying to maximize the growth of trees. And so as you can see within these areas, over here on the left in adaptive management, there's some large openings where there's a lot of space in between those trees, but then the spatial treatment, there's not. And what that does is it changes that behavior of fire in addition to a lot of different things. So if you can imagine over here on the left, when you get snowfall into the forest, you're going to get snowfall to hit the ground in these areas that are red, but where there are trees, they're going to hit the canopy, and usually that's going to evaporate. And then if you have snow in these areas, it's also providing shade. So that snow is going to persist longer throughout the year and provide clean water into the system. Nowadays, we don't have a lot of that. We don't have openings where the snow is going to hit the ground. So a lot of it is evaporating before it can even get into the system. In addition, these openings within the forest, they change things like air mixing. So pheromones from insects will travel differently through a stand where it's nice and spaced. It'll consistently flow through, and they'll call in more insects, where in a more diverse stand, that air will mix and head up into the atmosphere, and those pheromones won't make it to other bugs. There's a lot of other benefits to these treatments, but largely the focus that we're looking at is fire. And in a fire situation, again, you would have ground vegetation in the openings. That would be, forage for people and for subsistent wildlife species. And then when a fire burned through those areas, they would typically burn that ground vegetation, but they'd never have a chance to make it into the crowns of the trees. If they did get into the crowns of the trees, these openings would act as small fire breaks, and it would slow the progression of fire as it burned. So what the Klamath tribes have done is we've recognized our ancestors and our elders' knowledge in the forest, and we've tried to take that and apply it. However, we don't have a way to do that because we don't own the land ourselves. And so we've been forced to sign agreements with the Forest Service in order to apply our philosophy of forestry into the forest. And we signed an agreement over a decade ago that has since sunset, and we're currently preparing to sign a 20-year agreement to do more of this work into the future. Under that agreement, we worked as a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, the tribes, and then the Forest Service. And it allowed the tribes to take lead on planning the treatments and then applying them. And so these are just photos of some of those treatments where we had our members out marking trees. So we're deciding which trees stay and go based on what we learned from these reconstruction plots and how we're reapplying it to the ground. And then we harvested those trees that would not have been there historically and probably wouldn't have been there if a natural fire regime had still been burning in these areas. And then ultimately, after we applied the logging treatments, we were able to put fire on the ground. So this is an example of some of the money associated with these treatments. And I think, as everybody knows, kind of money reigns supreme and drives a lot of the things that happen in the forest. And so what I'm trying to show here is that these treatments, while people said that they were not viable, especially economically, we've proven that they are. And under the master stewardship agreements, our treatments overall have brought in a total of $1.8 million as a byproduct of restoration. On July 5th, 2021, the bootleg fire burned through parts of the reservation. The bootleg fire was 420,000 acres. It took place during the worst drought on record. And so it had some of the most devastating consequences because of that. There were very few areas that survived this fire whatsoever. And fortunately for the tribes, our treatments were some of those places that survived the fire. So we did a lot of research and then applied that research to the ground in treatments. And so what you see here is this dark green is where there's still vegetation. So that's forested. This light green is where there's less vegetation or none. And so the bootleg fire started on Fuego Mountain and burnt over the course of a couple of weeks. But it burnt through, as you can see here, some areas where it's still dark green. These were our treatment areas. So this is where we were able to apply treatments through our partnership where the tribes led a lot of the research, the prescription writing, the application of that through marking on the ground, and then ultimately the logging treatments. And then we were able, through our partnership, to have that fire put on the ground, but that was done by our Forest Service partners, because the tribes haven't had capacity to be able to do that work ourselves. We actually did this work with a professional staff of 3 and hiring temporary employees. So as this fire burned through, what you're seeing here, and these white lines don't show up well, but they're progressively smaller. And this is showing the fire progression over per day. And so you can see as it's burning over time, it burned through some of these key areas. Now, if you look up here to the north, there's a really key section as well. And that was an area that we did surrounding the Nature Conservancy Research Station. And as you know, they were our partners on the Master Stewardship Agreement. And so in these treatment areas, the Nature Conservancy was actually able to apply prescribed fire with some of our tribal members as they were training to become part of our fire program. These treatments also survived the bootleg fire, and in addition became very key areas that were able to stop the fire before it got into some very dense and difficult areas that probably would have burned hot and continued the fire to the north, and it would have been difficult to stop. So these are examples of some of our treatments. And then these are drone photos that I took of our treatments on the ground. And if I go back here, what you're looking at is, if you can see over here, this little triangular area, that's this picture right here. And so that triangle would look kind of like this. And so as you can see, to the north of the treatments here, there had been no treatment in those areas for a very long time. Those are meadow riparian areas that have grown in with lodgepole, which is largely invasive if left unaddressed by fire. And so these became very dense and overgrown with lodgepole. And as you can see, they burned really hot and almost completely. And then down here to the south of the green area, that was also part of our treatment area, where we were only able to get the thinning treatments in there, but not the prescribed fire. And the line between this is actually a road that was used to put the fire on the ground. But there was nothing up in these higher elevation areas to the south that provided a good boundary and allowed them to get fire on the ground. So those areas, in addition, burned, and a majority, up to 80% of it burned. And we think that they may have survived the fire if it wasn't such a drought situation. However, they didn't, and they burned up. So we can see that thinning alone wasn't enough to prevent fire from burning up the stands. But what did prevent the fire from burning the stands was thinning plus prescribed fire. And so this is just an example of historical knowledge, and the fact that, you know, we've understood that our ancestors applied fire to the landscape for millennia, and it was the only landscape tool that we could have used to have a big impact in the forest. And so, you know, today we're talking about trying to apply prescribed fire with a lot of times crews of dozens of people wearing Nomex and a lot of times hundreds of people, where historically it would have been 1 or 2, and we would have just done it intelligently and for purposeful reasons to make sure that we're enhancing our foods, because we never would have left that up to chance. And then we would have used timing. So it would have been done in the fall. We wouldn't have burned in the spring when the birds are nesting and our foods are growing. We would have done it in the fall when those species weren't there, and it would have been less damaging to the overall environment. So from the former BIA forester, They said a very long time ago, it's obvious that the present policy of attempting to complete protection of ponderosa pine stands from fire raises several very important problems. If ponderosa pine is desired in vast areas, how, unless fire is employed, can other species such as white fir be prevented from monopolizing the ground? We're seeing that today. That's exactly what's happening. Even with unlimited funds, personnel, and equipment, can they give reasonable assurance that they can continue to keep such extremely hazardous stands from burning up? The answer is no, and the answer will continue to be no until we come together and recognize that the environment is what made us and sustains us, and we can't control it. Then are we going to learn that we need to apply fire in an intelligent way at an intelligent time for an intelligent reason? And doing it just to prevent wildfires is not a good reason. There's purposeful reasons for us to apply fire to the ground. There's cultural reasons, and they still exist for all of society. This is an opportunity, I think, that we've found in our region that has been vastly devastated by some of the timber industry's use of our forests, that we can restore these places and we can protect them and we can enhance them, and we could have a lot more out of our forests than simply grazing or timber practices. So this is just an example again of what the Klamath tribes have been working on, and at this point in time we are attempting to develop a fire program and are expanding our professional programs as well, so that we could have more of an impact on the landscape and work with the Forest Service, hopefully co-managing the forests into the future. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. That was fantastic. And that photo is just so striking. That pair of photos. Thanks for sharing that. That was great.
Thanks.
Let's see. Zeke,
Hello.
are you ready?
Yeah,
And you said you're just going to share some Google Maps and stuff, right?
yeah, I think so. I wanted to see what Lainey and Steve are going to cover first.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
I'm at a conference. Lainey is probably in the next room. Or she might have left.
I'm still here.
Hey, Lainey.
I'm nearby.
He's gonna knock on the wall and see if you're in the next room. All right. Well, I pretty much wanted to talk about resources for reporting on fire. I've been in fire as a technician. I was realizing this conference I'm at, I came to one of the first ones in 1998, and it was on mapping and kind of information technology in wildfire. And so I've been working in kind of fire analysis and fire mapping and kind of map-based storytelling over the past 25 years. And the whole time, those 25 years, I've been kind of complaining about media coverage of wildfire and how we consistently, in the mainstream, get it wrong, and with our kind of inflammatory language and our kind of typical casting of fire as the foe and homeowners as the victims and firefighters as the kind of valiant heroes. And I feel like a lot of you are helping break that mold, asking good questions, and that one of the better roles potentially that people like Lainey and I can play is to kind of feed you an alternate take, alternate framing of the topic. And I use satellite imagery a lot for my work because I feel like it's a great resource for telling that big picture story. And so I want to share a little bit of that process. I want to share some stuff in Google Earth. I'm preparing a talk right now for this conference on kind of around fire mitigation and the idea that it's not going to work in a lot of places. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. The topic is called Plan on It Happening. And I'll talk a little bit about prescribed fire, but I feel like Lainey really covered the PBA, Prescribed Burn Association stuff pretty well. I guess I would just add that I'm an example of someone who's benefiting from that work, and that I've been in fire suppression as a kind of an intelligence analyst for 25 years. And I've had very little operational experience. And so that has really hamstrung me from becoming a burn boss, because the way the fire calls work, basically, it's all set up around kind of like being on a hotshot crew or something. You know, like basically, if you don't spend 10 years on a hotshot crew, no one really thinks you know anything. And the whole qualification system is set up around that kind of time spent digging trenches in the forest. And so those of us who spend our time clicking mice, really, we don't get signed off as, you know, burn bosses. There's no way under the current kind of federal qualification system that I'd ever be a burn boss. But I've been burning for almost 30 years. So Lenya did a lot of the heavy lifting, and I'm kind of like a couple weeks away from getting my certification as California State Burn Boss. I've been leading PBA burns. So the stuff she's doing is impactful, and I'm grateful for all the people that have done the kind of the real tedious lawyer type policy law writing work. Anyway, I feel lucky in my career that I've kind of gotten to bridge the operational and the kind of theoretical and analytical sides. So that's just to say that I'm going to kind of jump around quite a bit, but I want to provide you the resources to help you understand fire and to maybe pick some new stories. And also I want to invite you all to call me when big fires are happening to get a different take. So I wanted to start off a little with the Dixie Fire, because I grew up right in the middle of it. See if I can turn on. No, that wasn't what I wanted to do. Damn the live demo. I grew up right here in this little town called Westwood, and the Dixie Fire burned all the way around it. And so Lenya was showing a fire severity map. And this is a site that I'm on right now. It's called the EO browser, and it's a way to explore kind of really regularly acquired satellite imagery from the European Space Agency. This is from a satellite called the Sentinel. It flies over every 5 days, and it takes a satellite image at a kind of moderate resolution. You can, if you zoom in, you're not going to see individual houses, but it's collecting all these different kind of spectral bands of information. And so this one is called an NDVI, where it's looking at kind of photosynthesis. And so when Lenya's talking about kind of loss of forest, you can really see these pale areas. There's not much forest on those. You can slice this in different ways, and you can look at, just kind of like a typical true color image that's more like what you'd see in Google Maps or something. And you can also look at what we call the SWIR imagery, which is a shortwave infrared bands. And so these images, they're handy for talking about things like fire severity. And even though the Dixie Fire did burn across 1 million acres, not all 1 million acres had the same effects. So some places burned really hot and there's no trees there anymore. Other places, the fire was more moderate. And in other places, loggers have come and cut down all the trees since the fire. So like in this image, say, this hot pink area has all been clear cut after the fire. Red areas are burned and there's no living trees, but it has not been logged. These green areas are places that the fire just kind of laid down as it burned through there, and there's still living trees within that 1 million acres. And so, one thing we see a lot of in the reporting is that like the Dixie Fire devastated 1 million acres, or it scorched 1 million acres, or it torched, or it incinerated. And that's almost never the case. There's almost, in many places, 70% of the burned area in a large wildfire is low to moderate severity. And so these images can, you can write that and talk about that in lots of different ways, but these images then actually give you a visual where you can see like, oh, look, there's still a ton of green trees out in the middle of this forest. Why is that the case? And so that kind of comes back to what Stephen was talking about. There's always a reason that there's green trees standing in the middle of a burn. And sometimes it's luck, sometimes it's weather, sometimes it's past human action, thinning, burning, other things like that. So I just wanted to provide that kind of resource. The cool thing about this is that it goes over every 5 days. So, I can look at an image of it now, and then I can go back and I can say like, hey, what did this look like in 2020? It's like, oh, there's a whole forest there. If I look at that NDVI imagery that we started off with, you can start to really see like this massive change that's happened. You know, that this whole area here had thick forest on it before the Dixie Fire. Anyway, one thing that I do a lot is I'll take the imagery out of here and bring it into Google Earth, which then allows you to lay down other information. And so I want to talk a little bit here about a fire that we covered this summer over in the Klamath Mountains, where this fire burned for about 45 days, and this entire area that's white, most of that was lit on fire by firefighters as part of the kind of the plan, right? We had lightning fires, and kind of the strategy that made the most sense was, rather than to go and try to put them out on this really steep ground, was just to let them burn together, because they're on tops of the mountains and they were kind of slowly backing down the hill. So after it was all said and done, you know, they flew around with helicopters and dropped incendiary ping pong balls, and everything that's in white here got fire applied to it. And so when it's all said and done, we achieved like nearly 30,000 acres of beneficial fire effects, while still calling it suppression. And so when we talk about scaling up prescribed fire, in my opinion, and in a lot of people's opinion, we're mainly going to get prescribed fire done during wildfires by using kind of adaptive tactics, in large part because then the Forest Service is so broken that with the NEPA and all the environmental compliance work that they have to do, the Forest Service is not able to manage the land. And you can hear them talking about a big game about, we're going to spend $2 billion through the Inflation Reduction Act, there's other stuff, to then 10 million acres, whatever. It's not happening. Like, it really, the Forest Service is completely broken, right? And it's just, in the opinion of most people that I work with and in the timber industry, the Forest Service is not seen as a reliable partner. But one thing they are good at is using fire during fire season and getting this stuff done. And so because of, you know, when you've got a wildfire going on, you don't have to get air quality permits to burn. You don't have to write NEPA on all the work that you're doing on every single little thing. Most NEPA projects, when the environmental work is done, they cover maybe 3,000 acres. And the national forest is usually about 1 million acres. And a lot of these national forests used to have fire every 10 years. So you're talking about on a 1 million acre forest, you need to put fire on 100,000 acres a year to really keep up, to get back to a natural fire return interval. And if you're doing NEPA on 3,000 acre projects and it takes you 10 years to get your NEPA document done, you can see why the Forest Service is just not getting work done at scale. So I think more and more we're seeing that the incident management teams are using fire creatively during wildfires to achieve beneficial effects. Now, that is only really possible when the climate is conducive to beneficial fire effects. So last couple of years, we've had wet winters, we've had moderate burning conditions, and these lightning fires that have started on the tops of mountains have, you know, been, in a lot of ways, they're natural. They're started by God, right, during lightning season, which is when we've always had fires on these landscapes. And as they back down the mountain, they generally have in the past achieved beneficial effects. So we can't really take credit necessarily for the good acres we're getting during these wildfires. We can take credit for making the decision not to suppress them immediately and to manage them. The same thing isn't really the case on, say, the Dixie Fire. The Dixie burned during a drought. It was a human-caused ignition, and there were a lot of large-scale firing efforts that took place mainly to try to contain the fire. There wasn't a lot of people nursing the Dixie for good fire because it wasn't the season for it. It was August in a drought. And a lot of the fire effects that we got, a lot of the big, gnarly, high severity patches are the result of firing operations that escaped. You know, like during the fire, there was an effort made along this corridor here. When the fire was still down in this area, there was a major firing operation that happened here to try to pinch off this fire. And then the weather changed and that firing operation jumped the road and it burned like 100,000 acres in 3 days. It burned 50,000 acres of private timberland in a day. You can't really blame the firefighters because by the time you've got 300,000 acres of fire on the ground, it's a little bit late to, you're going to take what you can get. But also on this fire, big firing operations on the entrance to Lassen Park blew out, burned thousands of, tens of thousands of acres at high severity. So bad things happen when we're managing wildfires, also if it's in the wrong season. So there's a lot of subtlety to that story about how we can use fire to achieve resource benefits. Oftentimes it's, August of a drought year is not the time we want to do that. But 2 years later in August, when we've had a wet winter and we have got a mild summer, you have different options. So it's all to say that these things are really complicated. It's complicated to find the thread and to second guess whether or not this was the right tactical decision to put fire on the ground in August, right before a cold front blew out the fire. No, it wasn't. But what else? What other options do we have? When it comes to talking about landscape scale opportunities to increase prescribed fire, I think we have to look at, we've got this really changing canvas, right? If we're painting with fire. I wouldn't have thought 10 years ago that my entire home landscape would be completely different configuration, after a single fire season. We worked in 2020, I do a lot of kind of analysis and planning work, and we did a planning effort down here on about 1 million acres between, in the foothills south of Mount Lassen, looking at places to apply prescribed fire and thinning to compartmentalize the landscape and create opportunities to contain wildfires. Hey, can we burn 10,000 acres here? Like Steve did, and maybe contain a large wildfire that's burning out of the Feather River Canyon where it's not controllable. The problem with our analysis is that it assumed that the Forest Service had the capacity to actually implement projects at the landscape scale, and they don't. So this single Dixie fire, it burned about 60% of our entire 850,000 acre planning area. Lainey was talking about impacts of fire suppression, and all of these black lines on here are bulldozer fire lines that were built during Dixie. Like over 2,000 miles of bulldozer fire line. And oftentimes those are not really like trivial. Like this is a fairly major dozer line on the ridge. This isn't, the biggest dozer line I've ever seen. But when we talk about bulldozer fire line, we're talking about, acres and acres of completely just all the trees pushed over, piled in big piles. Dozers go through meadows, they go through archaeology sites, they go through former village sites. So the map, I think the mapping is interesting in that it shows all these dozer lines that are inside the fire, and kind of per that definition, then they failed, right? All these black lines right here are places that we thought we might stop the fire. And there were over 200 bulldozers assigned to this fire. And there were only like 10 dozer bosses or firefighters that are assigned solely to make sure the dozers kind of stay out of the meadows, stay out of the arc sites, put the line in the right place. So what's interesting to me in this is that this map is all about failure, right? Every black line on here that's not on the edge of the fire is a place that we caused environmental damage for no good reason, right? In most cases, it became clear quickly that the bulldozers, that the fire was, spotting a mile or jumping a mile and a half. And so a little, 200 or 300 yard wide, or, even 200 foot wide dozer line isn't going to help you when the fire's spreading from burning embers that are going a mile. Yet we kept doing it. We kept pushing these dozer lines for weeks and weeks. One of the things I find interesting is that this data is getting harder to come by as a kind of a journalist, right? I manage a fire mapping business, right? And so our business, right, made a lot of money producing maps on these fires and helping these guys generate this data. But as a journalist, I can't get this data, right? It's become harder. It's become, you know, more behind password protected sites. If you know it's out there, it's a great resource. And during the Dixie Fire, it was being posted to a public website where I could download it and make these maps. But now I can't do that. Right. But the public, I think, has the right to know the tactics. And there's this kind of tension in, you know, most of you who've talked to kind of public information officers during fires have gotten this kind of, these real kind of straightforward agency talking points. And the fire organizations aren't used to criticism, and they're not used to good questions. They want to tell you the percent containment and how many houses they saved and all the great things they're doing. They don't want you to say, hey, it looks like you guys have pushed 2,000 miles of dozer line and 80% of it didn't work. How come you're still pushing dozer line? Or do you have the resources that you need to manage this incident? How come you're still using this tactic?
Zeke, we may need to wrap you up here pretty soon so we have time for questions. But this has all been really amazing.
Great. I guess the last thing I wanted to show you guys are, this is like my lack of preparation leading to a yard sale of media related fire imagery. This is an image of a campfire, and this is taken, so just coming back to resources available for journalism. This is publicly available satellite data. This satellite only goes over every like 8 days, so we kind of lucked out that it went over right in the kind of crazy timing of the fire burning paradise. I worked on a project with the LA Times, and during this fire, and they sent me this incredible data set called Locations of the Dead. And these are all places that people died during the campfire. And in this imagery, you can see like this is kind of 10:45 in the morning as the fire's burning into paradise. And you can see all these yellow dots are homes on fire. And a lot of the people that died, you know, quite a few people were in cars. A lot of people were in homes. That had the ages of people. And so what we see is that a lot of the people that died, they were old people. You know, median age is probably 75 or 80. But we talk a lot about mitigation and, you know, fuel breaks and ways that we're going to stop these big mega fires. And you can see that this fire it wasn't just one fire. There was these major spots all over the town, right? There was a huge spot fire that was like 2 miles ahead of the main fire. And so just wanted to kind of emphasize just that this imagery is incredible for telling these stories. The ways out of town were all impinged by fire. You know, this is only a couple of hours after the fire started, and already there's only a few main roads out of town, and all of them had fire against them. And people who were trapped, a lot of them were trapped just by a small little fire. Anyway, when we talk about mitigation, I think it's good to talk about the limits of mitigation too, and the structural problems that we've got with the way towns are laid out, the ways that this town was never planned. There was like very minimal planning that went into this town getting sliced up into parcels, right? And then so we're rebuilding this town, but we're not really taking any efforts to change the footprint, right? So we're rebuilding, the town has got this DNA that is conducive to it killing people during wildfires, because there was absolutely no consideration of fire behavior when we chopped this landscape into privately owned parcels. So you've got these parcels where all these people live on the very edge of the canyon, and their parcel is so small that you can only build right at the very edge of the canyon. There's no safe place on this entire lot to build a house. And each person's got an acre and a half that they own that they probably can't manage, because you would need a winch and a helicopter and you know, there's physically very difficult to manage the vegetation on this And in many cases, we see places where the lot is so narrow that you can't even fit a chipper down the driveway to get in the backyard. So how are you supposed to cut brush and get it out of there? So this is what I'm talking about here at this conference. It's just that we had an opportunity after Paradise burned. We knew, I wrote a report 20 years ago that said Paradise was going to burn. And I talked to a woman who was a fire veteran who knew 40 years ago that Paradise was going to burn because of the vegetation and the climate and the winds. We knew that, but we had no plan when Paradise did burn. So, like, we spent $2 billion scraping all the houses off this ridge after the fire. And we could have spent another 100 million and bought 10,000 lots. And redesigned it, right? Built new streets, moved houses, invented new lots that aren't right at the edge to give you the suicidal building envelope. But that didn't happen. And instead, the town has kind of judged the success of their response and how many building permits they can reissue in as short a period of time to allow people to rebuild their places. But in a lot of the cases, we're just rebuilding the exact same urban footprint and setting up the same thing to happen 50 years from now, or 30 years from now, or 10 years from now, because the town is right up against this amazing canyon that is impossible for us to really manage vegetation on. We can't mow the brush. We can probably not prescribe burn just because of, So there's a story. Plan on it burning, and maybe we can start in the future planning ways that we're going to rebuild better or fix structural problems that make it impossible to manage
Thanks,
the vegetation and hazards. All right, you're welcome.
Sorry, I'm sure everybody here could listen to another hour of that because it's really amazing information that you're saying. And I know we have a ton of questions piling up, so we're just going to start at the top. Let's see who was first. I think Marshall, you were first. I mean Murphy, not Marshall. Murphy.
Hey, yeah, thanks. I'll make it as brief as possible. Just a quick clarifying question, Zeke. First, when you're talking about the Forest Service essentially doing prescribed fires within wildfires, you're basically talking about wildfire use. Is that correct, or are there other terms used for that? And then I have a larger question after that.
The language around fire use is complicated, and it's changed a lot over time. It's such a political topic. Forest Service might manage a fire and then lose control of it, and decide they're not going to use that word anymore. But basically, these fires that they're calling them full suppression fires, and it's more of a question of the tactics that they're using.
Awesome. And then I think the question that some others will have is, I really appreciated your comments about how the Forest Service and other agencies talk about wildfire incidents, just very simple, unnuanced, acres burned, structures lost, etc. I really liked you breaking down burns by kind of like intense, severe, damaging fire versus potentially beneficial or good fire. When we're all covering individual incidents, are you like actively, do you have like scripts like running that are basically like generating that sort of like imagery and analysis as those satellite images are being produced? Because I think it would be wonderful to get into stories like, 100,000 acres have burned, but only, 15,000 of them, or exceed some threshold to be severe, just to kind of get, because I think like a big thing that we're dealing with is just like fire bad, fire good, and just not able to have like the complex conversations that are necessary.
Yeah. Well, and oftentimes high severity fire isn't necessarily bad. There's many ecosystems like Southern California chaparral or lodgepole pine in the higher elevations where that's the regime, that's the natural pattern in those vegetation types. So it is tough to tease it apart because so much of that's a values judgment. Good fire in one place might be hot fire. Other places, hot fire may be causing watershed damage or impacting fish. But yeah, we are, that site I showed you, the Sentinel imagery, is really useful for getting a quick snapshot and seeing where you've got green trees and red trees.
And that's publicly available, Zeke?
Yeah, if you Google EO browser, that's the European Space Agency's kind of clearinghouse, and you can search using a map, you can search by date. So then, yeah, we do some additional analysis if we really want to get technical and like calculate acres, but for the most part, I've just been pulling that stuff into Google Earth and talking about it.
Excellent.
All right, Claire, you're up next.
Hi, Zeke. I'm Claire Fieser, based out of Charleston, Post and Courier in South Carolina. And we were gonna do a look back at the Gatlinburg fire, which was happened up in Great Smoky Mountains. It was one of the deadliest fires in the Southeast. Since 1950. And we were looking at some maps to kind of pull through this look back. But what you kind of pulled up, looking at the Paradise Fire and then overlaying with the kind of locations of the dead, we had numerous deaths and hundreds of injuries here. Can you just, is it the EO browser that you pulled the satellite image for? And then where'd you get the data for, locating where these people who died?
Yeah, so LA Times took the report from the sheriff's office and they created data from the addresses.
Okay.
And then there was a database there, like where was the person? Were they in their car? Were they in their house? What was their age? And so I got that data from them. And then I had the satellite data that I had processed separately and brought into Google Earth. I could put them together there in Google Earth.
And where'd you get that satellite data?
I got that from NASA. So
NASA.
I downloaded the raw data, and so I run a GIS company. So we got the raw data, and then we created visualization that used the infrared info to see through the smoke, basically, to create the visualization that you see.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
Ray, you are up next.
Sorry about that. Hi, Lenya. So I live in an area where there used to be a fair amount of spring pasture burning 30 years ago. And for various reasons, probably generational change, municipal regulations, that's died out. That know-how is lost. Nobody does that anymore. And I'm interested in the attitudinal challenge of bringing back or democratizing fire on the landscape when people see it as something that's scary or they don't know how to do it anymore. So
Yeah, well, I have two comments on that. One is that I don't know where do you live?
Well, it's in Canada. It's in central Canada.
Oh, cool. Okay. I was just gonna say, I think one of the things is that at least in a lot of the Western US, people aren't as scared or resistant as we think they are. So I think that can be one surprise, is that you start talking to people about fire use and their grandpa did it, or maybe they did it when they were a kid and they haven't in a while. So there's a lot of interest and understanding of the value of fire, and people aren't as resistant as you might think. I think the best way to get people talking about it and get people excited about it is really just to encourage them to become involved. So I love to bring people out, even if you're doing a burn that is really small. It could be a 1/4 acre, or it could be even smaller than that. And once people start to see it, they understand that it's really not as scary as they thought it might be. We typically picture wildfire conditions. So when you see little fire putzing around on the ground, it's like, oh, this is actually really a lot more manageable than I realized.
Thanks.
Okay, Kylie.
Hey, this is a question for any of the three panelists. When a burn boss was arrested on a prescribed burn in Oregon last fall, there was a lot of concern at the time about that having a chilling effect on future prescribed burns. And now that we're a little over a year out, I'm just wondering, has there been any longstanding fallout from that for you or any of the burns that you've been involved with, or has that kind of blown over and wasn't the issue that people thought it might be?
I can take a stab at that. I think I talked to you about that at that time, Kylie. And I'd say I think we all kind of knew that was very specific to that location and the politics of that place. And I mean, to me, it was kind of a one-off. I was never very concerned about it, frankly. And I haven't heard anything more about it since. So yeah, I think my intuition on that one was right. Or at least I like to think so.
All right.
Yeah, I feel the same
Go
way.
ahead. Yep.
Yeah, it seemed pretty clear it was political theater. That said, I think it does speak to like the hostility that and reasons that people don't want to work for the Forest Service, you know, that they're losing employees, that if it's not the hostile workplace environment, it's the hostile cultural environment around them, but also that they kind of deserve that. In most places, the Forest Service is really the bad guy. They've really fucked things up, and people hate them for that. They hate the fact that the Forest Service cut down all the big trees. They hate the fact that the Forest Service walked away from the timber industry. It's like, no matter what side of the kind of political spectrum you fall on in the West, you can find a reason to really think the Forest Service is full of shit.
Yeah, I totally agree, Zeke. And I think that it really speaks to the value of community-based fire leaders, you know, people who are part of the community. So yeah.
I did a little rant on that on Twitter or YouTube when it happened. It was just that in these places where they want to play militia, like, why not? You know, if the sheriff's job is to protect the citizens, probably one of the greatest threats to the citizens in Eastern Oregon is not Antifa. And it's not, you know, terrorism, it's fire. And so if he really wants to protect his citizens, the sheriff's department should be building a PBA. And they get to, you know, dress up in gear and drive around in quads and like talk on radios. It's like all the things that militia members probably like doing the most. Like, well, give them torches and like, let's create a fire militia, you know?
Awesome. Darius?
Hey everybody, this sort of builds off that community piece. This past summer in British Columbia, when we had a lot of big fires in the interior, one of them was burning near a bunch of structures, and two fires were set to merge right as a cold front was sweeping through with strong winds, and the fire service, sort of as a last-ditch effort, tried to do a prescribed burn to stop those fires from merging. But when that front swept through, instead it caused the fires, or it joined the two fires that were likely would have merged anyway. And in a time that was already very hostile towards the fire service, a lot of people had already been evacuated. It was not a great look for the fire service. And so we in the newsroom got the information first, and there was a lot of uncertainty in how to report it, because you didn't want to say that the prescribed fire caused the merging, because it would have happened anyway, but it was a tense time. So how would you go about talking about that sort of thing when that happens, when it might have likely been inevitable anyway, but it did happen, and there's a lot of hostility between the fire service?
Right. Well, so it sounds to me, so the burn that they did was actually a burnout operation as part of the fire suppression strategy.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important distinction. And I mean, often we conflate those types of burnout operations with prescribed fire as if they're kind of the same thing. And they really aren't. I mean, I'd say an operation like that is a suppression tactic that's used a lot. I mean, it's an important tool in the suppression toolbox, but prescribed fire is a much more thoughtful, well-planned, you know, very nuanced and artful. I mean, I would really call it, there's an art to it, and often informed by the ecology and the people of a place. And so I think if I were reporting on that, I would make it clear that that's not a prescribed burn. It's a suppression tactic, and it's under triage conditions, and those tactics don't always work, you know, so, but that it's not prescribed fire. I don't know, Zeke, what do you think?
Yeah, that was my same thought. It's just that language is super important. And if you're reporting on wildfire, I'd behoove you all to kind of get get someone in your pocket that really knows the nuances of the language, because we don't want to have prescribed fire lumped in with firing operations. Like as Lainey says, they're quite different. But I think back to like how to report on it, it's good to frame it among the options. It's good to frame the options that the fire managers had at that point. And would the community be more or less resentful if the firefighters had done nothing? And so there's often this kind of feeling that we had to try something. We had to try, the only other option was to let the town burn. So we had to try something, and we did it. And then unfortunately, our firing operation made things worse. It's oftentimes, no one wants to put fire on the ground under severe conditions when there's massive wildfires burning. And it's almost always a kind of last ditch effort. But I think it's a good conversation to have. It's like, well, maybe you would have been better off if the firefighters had not done anything. But then people would still blame them, right? So I think that's the story. It's like, what were they supposed to do? Here's this person, this incident commander had like nothing but terrible options, and they picked what they thought was maybe the least terrible option, and it made things worse.
I think it's interesting that the fire officer we talked to actually did call it a prescribed fire. It was planned like 3 days out, and they decided to go forward with it. But yeah, it's a.
I think most people would call that a fire. They'd call it a firing operation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Ashira, this may be the last one.
Okay, great. I'll try to be quick. I'm working on a story about PBAs right now, so this was all super interesting, specifically in the Southeast. I'm based in Florida, in North Florida. But I'm curious, kind of based on what has been said overall through this whole session of like, you have PBAs as these community rooted, very like sort of knowledgeable about their specific local environment, ways of managing fire. And I'm wondering kind of how maybe there's a possibility for, with you looking at the state of California, but maybe also kind of a broader like networking effect that can bridge like locally rooted to locally rooted organizations of PBAs.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a networking situation going on, and a lot of us who work on these issues are talking a lot and connecting, and sharing lessons learned and stuff. I actually just partnered with I'm University of California Cooperative Extension, but I partnered with Oregon State Extension and North Carolina Extension folks, and we just did a survey of all national prescribed burn association leaders. So to find out, what about the different things they're working on and the success they're having and the lessons they're learning. But as part of that, we actually hosted a webinar for all the PBA leaders from around the country, which was really cool because you've got, these are like landowners and stuff, and they don't often get to connect with each other, especially not across state lines and across the country. So we're planning to continue to do that and increase those networking opportunities because it was pretty cool. We had about 80 people on this webinar, and from rural Texas and North Florida and rural California. So yeah, there's a lot of value in that.
All right, we're going to make time for one more question because Jamie has a question for Steve. And Steve has not gotten to weigh in yet on this situation. So, Jamie?
Yeah, so it actually has a little bit as well to do with Lania said about some of the challenges facing prescribed and cultural burning, like liability and insurance. And I'm just curious, what are some of the ongoing fights right now, Steve, that you could point to in terms of challenges to prescribed and cultural burning that isn't just wildfire prevention focused?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'm coming from a tribal perspective, and very focused on trying to develop out a program for the Klamath tribes, but I think that it's interesting to me that what I've seen over time is that people aren't taking control of protecting their own property. And I think that a lot of that comes from over time, we haven't been allowed to, whether it's because of smoke rules, or something else. to where we can't just get out there, take care of our property and not have to worry about having certifications or regulations or other things like insurance. So I think that there's definitely, it's nice to hear about these associations coming together, because the community used to sheriff our forests and our lands. We took care of it without the need of government, and we're still capable of that. But it seems like there are just too many controlling factors around the smoke rules and other regulations that prevent us from getting out there and doing that work. And that applies to a tribe as well as individuals.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. And thank you so much to Lania and Zach as well. IJNR golf clap for everybody. Thank you so much for all of your insights and for saying some things that I think people really need to hear. And I'm sure you're going to hear from all of these folks, since they will be getting your contact information. And I foresee a lot of reporting on the things that you three have talked about today. So thank you again. And journalists, we will be back here in 1 hour. We will see you soon.
Thanks.